Our next presenter is Doha Chibani, who will be presenting on effects of apparent ethnicity in an individual's name on perceived qualifications in the professional service industry. Doha's research is mentored by Professor Diane Alonso from the Psychology Department.
Check your part of dictionary.
Sorry, it's like a bunch of people. They're here for the extra. Yeah. Okay. Doha Chibani from University. I went to the universities at Shady Grove, the psychology program. So the research started in the research class with Dr. Alonso, and then I continued on with it. I will be going over why the study, the purpose of the study, the background. I have used several research, but I will only be covering two. I'll give you the hypotheses, the methods, the results, and I will be discussing some of the issues. So why this study? We live in Washington, greater Washington, Baltimore area, and it's a very diverse area. So I wanted to see how the apparent ethnicity or race in a name could affect your likelihood of being contacted for services if you are a service provider, such as a doctor, an accountant, an architect. And then I wanted to look at how our biases, just from seeing the name, could influence whether we will be contacting that person or not. Some of the background, like I said, I looked at 5 research, but I will be only addressing 2. Price and her colleague actually did a qualitative study at the university, at Johns Hopkins University, the medical school. It's a qualitative study, and they actually interviewed non-tenured physicians who were on the tenure track. And many of these physicians said that they felt that in addition to their physical appearance, their name, their foreign name, their foreign credentials, and their accent made them feel like they had to justify themselves in the field. And then Wilson, who did a study in New Zealand, this tells us that it's not just an American phenomenon. Immigration is everywhere. So she and her colleagues studied in New Zealand the likelihood of being shortlisted for a job. So she actually divided the groups into more Europeanized names and just typical immigrant names. And what she found is what she called the ethnic penalty is a cumulative effect. So if you were born not in New Zealand, your name was typically ethnic, and you had credentials the same way, it affected your likelihood of being shortlisted. So the hypotheses for my study are, I wanted to see how participants will select professionals from different groups according to the familiarity of the name. So I wanted to see how likely they are to select a typical Caucasian European name or a typical African American name or other categories. And then I wanted to understand how our biases can affect the selection. So I will talk about a little bit after the methods, how some of the groups were selected more than others. So the methods, I recruited people from the greater Washington, Baltimore area, just from different offices and from schools. I got 35 people, and I actually varied in age from 20 to 66. They were a very diverse group. I did actually have a large Hispanic number of participants for some reason. The procedures, I provided them with a 31-item questionnaire. Many of the questions were just to collect demographic information and to just place the selections in context, so such as do you own a home before they would select an architect, or how many credit cards do you have before they would select a financial advisor. And then 6 of those questions were the actual selections that I was going to be studying, and you can see here that they were given a list, only one per ethnicity, and I only just stuck with men. And it's, like I said, to select only one you are most likely to contact for services. And you can see that the names are typical, either ethnic or racial. The results, so for the first hypothesis, participants will select professionals from different groups at varying rates. I used the chi-square goodness of fit to see the difference between the expected and the observed. I found actually a very high significance. Then I did a Kramer's V to see how much the ethnicity or race would affect the selection, and it turned out that it affects it about 60%. So what your name, if it's ethnic or racial, accounts for 60% of the selection. The table shows the expected and the observed. In ideal conditions, every single participant or group actually would be selected 30.8 times, but as you can see, some of them were selected a lot more than 30, and some of them were selected very few times. So the Caucasians were selected 53 times, and the Arab name was selected only 4 times, and this is across professions. So I wanted to see, because of that, which ethnicities or race were selected higher significantly. So I did a one-way ANOVA, and again, I found it significant. I did the post hoc to see the difference between the different groups. And the post hoc showed me that the African American names were selected significantly less than just the Caucasians. Then the Arab Middle Easterns were less than the Hispanic, the Jewish names, and the Caucasian. The Hispanic name did not show any significance against any other, and I will address that later. Like I said, I had a large number of Hispanic participants for some reason. So as you can see here, the difference, then Arab Middle Eastern was very low selection, and the Caucasians were really high, and that shows you the difference between the groups. So some of the discussion points. The limitation for this study is the participants only had one choice. They couldn't just select, from different, for each race they had several ones, so they couldn't actually go with different ones. Also, there was a little bit of a response bias where people just didn't feel like looking at the names, they're foreign names. So they sort of selected randomly a few of them. And it's actually a non-realistic situation. I sat down with a lot of the people afterwards to see why they selected the way they did, and many said that they would actually go with either references, or they would have the internet in front of them and they would actually look the people up before. Again, like I said, I had a high number of Hispanic participants. That's probably why the Hispanic names were not affected. For future direction, I would probably do a larger number of participants. I would ideally give them more selections, so they would have several people per ethnicity. One thing that some people said they didn't like is there were no females, and I didn't want to add that issue in there. So, for instance, one person said that she selected the Asian name thinking that was the woman. And also, I would probably continue on with a qualitative study to get more information. Even though I did sit down and ask some of the people, some said that they selected the Jewish name for financial advisor because they're better with their money. And actually, the Hispanic architect was selected a lot more, and people told me it was because usually Hispanic people work in construction to put themselves through school, so most likely they have more experience. But yeah, a qualitative study would bring in a lot more information. One recommendation I thought would be good coming out of this study is when you put your name in the yellow pages or whatever it is, usually it's probably better to go with a neutral name. So instead of naming your dentist, it's probably better to just name it something like Gaithersburg Dental or whatever I was trying to look at. I want to thank Dr. Alonso for her support, and Laura, the TA, helped me a lot. Dr. Youngblood from USG, and URCAD. Any questions?
I know
You can choose.
Okay.
I know you mentioned that one of the problems of the study was that it didn't seem realistic to some of the participants. So in future research, do you think it might be more realistic if you would look, like, would you be able to work with businesses to ask them if, like, they could, when they pick, like, if they have a large number of, like physicians at a clinic, for example, if you could ask the clinic if it would be okay if you could take a sample of what patients decide to go with which clients. Do you think that would help?
Yeah, I mean, that would be a good way to go about it. Take a neutral name and see which clients decide to go with which doctors or whatever it is financial. Usually they are routine. Yeah, if I had more time, I would probably have done that. Go ahead.
Very interesting study, by the way. Was there a significant reason why you decided to choose males only and refrain from using females?
I did not want. Yes, I didn't want to add another variable. I would have had to compare not only the ethnicities but also the gender. Like I said, one person was going to go with the female no matter what, and she picked the Asian name. Yeah, but I wanted to narrow it. Yeah, but if, like I said, I probably would have gone with more if I had more time. Yeah.
One more question?
Okay, go ahead.
I was just wondering, do you think the result would have been different if you had added like foreign names that they never heard of, like typical traditional names?
Yeah,
like,
that's what
like
I did.
Obama, for example.
Pardon me?
Like Obama is a typical African name. Do you think the result would have been different?
I understand what you're saying, especially for the African American, you mean? Yeah, probably. For the other ethnicities, I did pick typical names, like the Asian name. You couldn't tell whether I couldn't tell whether it was a male or female. For the African American, I tried to stick with typical African American names, but yeah, it probably would have given me a different outcome because people would have different assumptions. Maybe they don't speak the language, or yeah. Okay. Thank you.